Well, just a couple days ago, May 9th was Victory Day, which is celebrated around the world for the victory of the Allied forces against Nazi Germany in World War II. And certainly the Soviet Union was certainly the principal fighter there in that conflict and played the principal role in terms of bearing the brunt and fighting the Nazi war machine. So brought many of those issues back into focus here. And to talk more about all of this, we are very happy to be joined here on the show by Carlos Martinez, who's an author and activist and the co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Carlos, thanks so much for being back with us.
Hey guys, good afternoon. Good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you. And of course, I will just plug this here, The End of the Beginning, about the history of the Soviet Union there, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse by Carlos Martinez. You can get that here in the U.S. at 1804books.com. But, very important issue because, you raised this in the beginning of your book that the Soviet Union has many world historic achievements to its name, one of which being the Soviet legacy in World War II. And I was hoping we could just start there because especially here in the United States, this is a completely untold story. All we hear about is D-Day, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. Well, if you look at the map of Europe in 1942, right, you've got practically the whole of continental Europe. It's occupied by the Nazis or it's occupied by Nazi allies. Britain, where I am, was saved only by, the helpful existence of the English Channel. And it was the Soviet Union principally working with the partisan movements in Europe that defeated the Nazis. We don't talk about that. It's not fashionable to talk about that. It's not even, in high school history curriculums, that's not taught. In Britain, we seem to think World War II was won by a slightly chaotic evacuation of Dunkirk. In the US, you think that it was the Americans getting involved at the last minute, rushing troops to Western Europe to prevent France and Italy from going communist, that was some kind of crucial determining factor in the war. Of course it wasn't. It was the heroism of the Soviet Union, which lost 27 million people in the struggle to defeat fascism. And, I think it's worth saying on this program that victory was a victory for the socialist system, not just, a massive country. It wasn't just a victory for people's kind of patriotism and nationalist feeling. It was a victory for socialism, for rapid industrialization, for the kind of consolidation of forces and energy and economic resources at a scale that would have just been inconceivable under capitalism. Like, can you even imagine that kind of preparation under the Tsarist regime? Factories were built to be mobile such that when faced with invasion from the West, they were literally shifted east so that production could continue throughout the war. And it was also, I think, a victory for the socialist system in the sense that working people, ordinary people, the masses, the vast majority of the population truly felt they had something to fight for. If you compare the fate of the Soviet Union and its actions in that war with what happened in France or what happened in Holland or Belgium or Hungary or any number of other countries, those countries' national armies collapsed in a question of days and weeks and months, right? The Soviet Union kept fighting and furthermore won, right? So this is a big part of that, is that people were in a society that was built for them, something that working people had never had before, there or anywhere else. And they were able to make extraordinary sacrifices to defend it. And, the whole thing has a certain tragic but important resonance today in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, right? Because where so much of the fighting is taking place now in the Donbass region, that's the same towns, the same cities, the same villages, that so much of that incredibly intense fighting took place in the Second World War. Yeah, and at that time it was Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians fighting together against a fascist enemy. And now we've got this tragic twist, this tragic inversion, because the Ukrainian paramilitaries who've been fighting on the front line in the Donbass against ethnic Russian people for the last 9 years are literally neo-Nazis. We talk about celebrating Victory Day, and we think of the heroism of the Soviet people. You can't even celebrate that in Ukraine under kind of decommunization laws. The Soviet war memorials have been pulled down and replaced by statues of Stepan Bandera, who was a literal fascist. So these people, the Azov battalion, the right sector, and so on, they've been recast as nationalists, but they're fascists, they're white supremacists, they're anti-Semites. So, all of this, the Victory Day is a very important reminder of the success of the Soviet Union, as you've said, but also of what the Soviet Union and the anti-fascist peoples of the world fought for in that period.
Carlos, something that I learned a lot growing up in the United States whenever the issue of World War II came up is that if it wasn't for America, we'd all be speaking German. And so would all of Europe. Like, that's a constant. I mean, you know that too, Eugene. I'm sure you heard that at some point in school growing up and just from like random ignorant people. But another aspect of all of this that I think is very much connected to what you just mentioned about Ukraine today and the fact that NATO is basically supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine to do some of like the frontline fighting there against Russia is when we go back and we talk about Soviet history. I mean, part of the rise of fascism was, a result of wanting of people who could fight against communists, like the US and the UK and these capitalist countries were okay with Hitler until they weren't. Can you talk a little bit about that history of the rise of fascism and the fact that it was like allowed to proliferate and in some cases encouraged? Like we always hear about, Stalin made a deal with Hitler. We never really learn about, the West's role, the capitalist West's role in the rise of Hitler and other fascists.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Fascism historically has always arisen as a response to a combination of a crisis of capitalism. And if you think about the 1920s, 1930s, capitalism faced the biggest, most significant and substantial crisis that it's faced to date, in its history. And furthermore, a rise of an alternative ideology, an ideology of the working class, i.e. communism, socialism, Marxism, which was gaining strength massively. And there's no question that the ruling classes in Europe and the US, to a degree, supported the rise of Mussolini, supported the rise of Hitler, supported the rise of Franco. The Spanish Civil War is a perfectly good test case for that, because what side were the Americans on in the Spanish Civil War? What side were the British on? They didn't side with the Democrats. They didn't side with the Republicans. They couldn't say it clearly because they had to maintain their posture as Democrats. But the fact is, they prevented any supplies from going to the Republican side, and they didn't do anything about the supplies that were going from Germany and Italy to the nationalists, to the fascist side. So all through that period, right up until the end of the 1930s, it was the clear aim and strategy of the Western powers, led by Britain, that Hitler should be leveraged against the Soviet Union. The whole process of kind of pacification and accepting what Hitler was doing in Poland and Czechoslovakia and elsewhere was about, let's appease Hitler, let's give him what he wants, and let's just encourage him to go east and to fight against the Soviet Union. And then those two can exhaust each other. We'll kill two birds with one stone. It's very controversial to say so, but that strategy was ultimately defeated by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. If it hadn't been for that pact, that would have been the trajectory of geopolitics in the late 1930s. Germany would have gone to war against the Soviet Union in 1939, and the Soviet Union would have lost 2.5 years of preparation, which proved to be absolutely crucial in the trajectory of that war.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an amazing history, and of course, they never tell us how the Soviet Union was desperately trying to work with the West, and only ended up where they were in 1939 because of the inability there. But huge piece. But one of the other things I want to get to as well, and you've already sort of alluded this to a degree, the unique aspects of the Soviet Union that allowed them to resist, central planning in particular. And I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more about what the Soviets were able to do in their society by planning it rather than just leaving it to the market as we do here in the capitalist West these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important for socialists and leftists to study the Soviet Union and to kind of own that experience, because apart from anything else, it had some stunning successes. We're always told that socialism doesn't work, right? And we're told that the Soviet Union was a failure, that it was a authoritarian, miserable type of society. But actually, any serious analysis of history just doesn't bear that out at all. For one thing, the peoples of the territories of the Soviet Union experienced an absolutely unprecedented improvement in their living standards. Feudalism was wiped out, which is not a small thing, right? The Soviet Union emerged from being a pretty backward, compared to Western Europe, compared to North America. Russia at that time was a backward state. And within a couple of decades, it was a superpower. It was one of two superpowers. It was the second biggest economy in the world. It became a global leader in multiple areas of science and technology. It became a pioneer in arts and culture. For the first time in Russian history, famine stopped being a problem. The Soviet Union built the first comprehensive welfare state, the first country to have free education at all levels, the first country to have free healthcare and a guarantee of housing available to everyone. Universal literacy was achieved in a matter of 2 decades. It was even, and this is, I think, really surprising to a lot of people, the USSR was a trailblazer on gender equality. Where did women first get the right to vote? Where did they first get freedom to divorce? Where did they first get, the right to abortion and bodily autonomy? What country was it that innovated on childcare provision and socialization of domestic labor? It was the Soviet Union. Actually, there's an interesting statistic. By the 1970s, there were more female doctors in the Soviet Union than in the whole, rest of the world combined. It was an affirmative action state. It was an anti-racist state. Racial and ethnic discrimination were banned, were made punishable offenses long before that was the case in the US or Britain. At that time, in the 1930s, African Americans faced what in the United States? Lynching and segregation. So you had very important civil rights leaders and Black American activists, such as W.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson or Langston Hughes, going to the Soviet Union and saying things like, this is the first place that I've been that I'm treated with dignity and respect as a human being. The unemployment problem was solved. Capitalism still hasn't found a way to solve the unemployment problem or the housing problems. But in the Soviet Union, they were solved in, humanity's very first socialist experiment, right? And as we've been talking about, fascism was defeated. They built a country that was sufficiently strong, sufficiently advanced, united, and determined that it could defeat the Nazi armies. And, Victory Day, as I say, is a reminder of that, of how much humanity owes the Soviet people and how much they contributed to creating the world that we live in today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there we go. I lost you for a second there, Carlos. You are back with us now, but I really appreciate this. Sorry, Ronnie, did I cut you off?
No, I was just cheering for the little box rearrangement.
Yes,
which is
absolutely crucial. Well, Carlos, as always, we really appreciate you having you with us. I just have to plug it again. The End of the Beginning: Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. Whether you know a lot or a little about the Soviet Union, I'm telling you, this book is fascinating, very important. You should study it. You should read it. You can get it from Leftward Books, and if you're in the U.S., you can go to 1804books.com, and you can get it from there. And the footnotes, I will say, are also an excellent guide to Soviet history. So as always, Carlos Martinez, really appreciate having you with us. Friends of Socialist China, also couldn't recommend it any higher. Thanks for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. See you soon.